On October 21st, 1994, almost 20 years ago, Roger Ebert wrote a review of Hoop Dreams that led me to go see it in the movie theater, a lot of other people in the movie theater. The first paragraph of that review, the final two words were life itself. It was, one of the all-time great glowing reviews, and I think my guest who directed the Roger Ebert documentary, the great documentary, just came out, Life Itself. It's available on demand. That's where I saw it last week. Would probably agree with me to a large extent that life changed the day that review came out and when Siskel and Ebert reviewed it. And Steve joins us today. How are you, Steve?
I'm good. I'm good.
Is that an accurate description? I mean, did your career go from one place to the next place once Siskel and Ebert talked about it?
How about I went from not having a career to having a career? How's that? Yeah. I mean, Roger's review, you have to understand that I had been a fan of his for several years up until then when I moved to Chicago in 85, so almost 9 years earlier. Mm-hmm. I'd been reading him regularly, and he was my go-to film critic. So for him to say that about a film of mine was just, made me speechless.
So when did the relationship start? So obviously he writes that review, and I remember watching Siskel and Ebert talking about the movie as well. I think Ebert had it as his number one movie of that year. Is that right, in 94?
He did.
He did. Yeah. And one of the top ones of the decade, right, in the 90s?
Well, actually, it was the top one.
I know. I wanted you to say it. I was going to walk you into it. So what was your relationship like with him all the way to sort of the beginning of the conversation of doing this documentary?
Well, what was the relationship like going back to 94?
We'll say 94 till whatever, 2000. Whatever.
Well, the funny thing is that Roger and I didn't talk much at all. Mm-hmm. We had a friendly, cordial, professional relationship, even though we were both here in Chicago. But we didn't hang out. We weren't buddies. I would see him at public events here and there, and it was always very friendly. But I never thought that I could have much more of a relationship than that because he was a film critic and I was a filmmaker. So for me, it was more the way in which he continued to support my work over the years. He continued to write eloquently when talking about my films and liked them, which I was very grateful to. And so, but I didn't really have that kind of relationship. And I think it actually ended up being a benefit to doing this film. I would have loved to have had that relationship if I'd known that was possible. But it really ended up being a benefit to the making of the film because I wasn't a friend. I wasn't beholden to Roger in any way, really, other than the fact that I wouldn't have made the film had I not had, a degree, of course, of admiration for who he was and what he had accomplished.
So how did the process begin? When did you start shooting this? So Hoop Dreams you shot, I think, 250, 300 hours, right? Is that about right?
That's about right, yeah.
So for this, when did you start? How many hours did you shoot? What was sort of the process of filming this documentary?
Right. Well, in Hoop Dreams, we shot for about 4.5 years.
Right.
We did not do that with this film. With Roger, it was more like 4 months because, again, when we started, we did not expect that his health was in such decline that he wouldn't live to see the film completed. That wasn't a motivating factor in starting the film, but that's what happened. And so 4 months into our filming, he passed away, which, of course, was a tremendous loss to so many people and to film culture. And so, I knew that what I wanted to do was to film his daily life over the course of a year. And then while I was doing that, to conduct interviews with people who were important to telling the story. And all that did happen, but it happened with far less from Roger than I had originally anticipated.
The Ebert, I read the book, Life Itself, and I was obviously a huge Ebert fan. Even grew up in Massachusetts, I would get his movie yearbook every year. I'd watch Siskel and Ebert every weekend. I was into it as a film guy as a kid. I'm a sports guy now, but as a film guy as a kid, and still a big film fan. He was the guy for me. So when I saw you were doing this, I was fascinated by it, and I saw it. And like I said, I've talked about it on the radio all week. It's great. You did it. You hit a home run. It's a great documentary. But
thank you so much.
No, that's fine. It was really well done. It seemed to me, I don't know Roger Ebert, but reading Roger Ebert over the years, that if Roger Ebert were ever to be a subject of a documentary, he would absolutely want it to be warts and all. And obviously you could tell you like Roger Ebert. A lot of people like Roger Ebert, but it's not one of these documentaries where, it is a total fluff piece. I mean, there are warts on there, and they're shown in this.
No, absolutely, and you're right. I think Roger absolutely didn't want that either. He would have wanted to see a film on him that would be the kind of film he'd want to see on anybody, not just him, which is to present a three-dimensional portrait of that person. And that's what I endeavored to do. And like you say, though, I mean, my affection for Roger certainly comes through in the movie. Frankly, I wouldn't have done the film if I didn't feel that affection towards him and admire him, because he had done too much for my career. If I'd read the memoir and thought, gee, this guy's kind of a jerk, really, and I'm not that interested in his life, I wouldn't have made the film, because I would have just stepped away from it and said, good luck with that if anybody wants to make that film. But so clearly I needed to feel for him and feel affection for him to even want to do it, which I did. But it, like you say, it didn't prevent me from wanting to show the full man and take a full measure of him, because that's what made him so interesting and makes him a worthy film subject.
It does seem to me, somebody who's seen your films, that whether it's William Gates or Arthur Agee's mom, or Bo Agee or William Gates' brother, or Stevie, or now Roger Ebert, it seems to me from your documentarian point of view that it's important that you have some affection for the subject. Is that fair? Absolutely.
Yeah, Roger says at the beginning of this movie that the movies are like a machine to generate empathy. It's a famous quote from him that I put right up front.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, there's no better definition of what the movies should aspire to be, and oftentimes fall short of. But when they do achieve that, that's the glory of a great movie, in my view. And I think it especially applies to documentary, because we're dealing with real people's lives in documentary. And so I think he put to words something that I have felt all my career but never could articulate like he did, which is that my goal has always been to try to help you understand people, and sometimes very difficult people, and sometimes people that have done terrible things. But my goal is to have you understand them, not sit in judgment of them, not to offer excuses for bad behavior or apologize for bad behavior. I don't try to do that, but I do want you to understand them. And so that's always been an important part of deciding to do a movie and who I focus on.
Does it? My guess would be yes. You'd obviously know better than me. Does it ever feel, particularly when you're doing this? Well, I guess even when you're, in a house like the Agee house, where they're struggling and there's no electricity and they're doing this, or you're in the hospital room with Roger Ebert and his wife and he's getting that suction. Do you ever feel like, Jesus, why am I in here? Why should I be in here? Is that? I mean, that must be a battle. I would think you must deal with.
Yes. No, you're right. I mean, I think one of the hardest things, there are so many things I love about documentary filmmaking. I could go on and on and on about what I love about it. The hardest thing about it is that in the movies that I do, and it's true for a lot of filmmakers, but I'll just speak for myself, in the movies that I do, where I'm spending a lot of time with people and getting to know them in a way that goes beyond just profiling someone. The hardest thing is when bad things happen to them or struggles. There are times when you do feel like I'm just a kind of leech here, capturing this drama of their lives, but it's their lives, and for me, it's a film. And of course, no one in that position can fail to recognize that drama is at the heart of what makes for compelling movies. So if you did a documentary about someone that nothing ever happened to,
right,
it wouldn't be a terribly interesting film. So you do sometimes feel that way, and my only way of grappling with that is that my hope is to always feel like I go home at the end of the day. There are times when I've stopped the camera, and there's times when I've not gotten or filmed certain things, and I was happy not to. For instance, Roger's death. I mean, there was no camera there to document that,
mm-hmm.
and even though I went down, Chaz told me to come down after he passed to the rehab institute where his body was lying in the chapel. I took the camera, but I never got it out of the bag because it never felt right to do. But I think that's why, getting back to the empathy thing, I think that's part of the way in which I deal with being in a position to capture very difficult things in people's lives. That's why I take it as so crucial and vitally important that what the film does is not hopefully make you feel like this person has been exploited, but that they've been understood. and that at a deeper level. Because to me, that's the only way I can rationalize some of the things that I've been in a position to film.
I look at the documentary as sort of three love stories: newspapers, Siskel, and Chaz. I mean, that's sort of the way I look at it, the way I split it up. I mean, obviously he was a newspaper man. Obviously Chaz came in later in his life and sort of changed his life. But, for me, maybe it's because it's when I grew up and it's the thing I associate him still with the most. To me, the parts of the movie I enjoyed the most were the Siskel stuff. I feel like there's probably a documentary there on its own, Siskel and Ebert.
Sure.
It's a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah,
it's just a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah, could have easily made just a film on that. I feel like we do it justice.
Yes, I agree.
But you're right. It's the most entertaining part of the film without question. But it's even moving at the end when Siskel dies. But it's like, I mean, Roger. There were so many aspects to his life that I found fascinating as well. And when you talk about love story, those three are definitely qualify. Mm-hmm. But I think you could also add in there a love of the city of Chicago.
Right. True. Right. Absolutely. Right.
And you could add in there really ultimately a love of life, because I think ultimately what all of those loves add up to is Roger's profound love of living life.
Well, is that great? Is that great Ben Bradley quote? One of his friends tells it in the story is that Bradley pitches Ebert numerous times over the years, right? And Ebert has that line, "What do I want to learn new streets?" Or is that the line?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a great line. Yeah,
exactly.
And it just is a pure film reviewer. I mean, you're talking to the guy who obviously won the Pulitzer, but I mean, you don't think of him sometimes, and I think the TV might have hurt. And you get into that as well, where you're right, but you almost forget what a great writer Ebert was, and then you almost relearn it again. At least I did as an adult. Once he wasn't able to go on television anymore, and he started blogging more, and I followed him on Twitter, obviously, and you forgot this guy is just flat out a great writer.
That's right. Yes, you're exactly right. I think that the TV show gave him enormous power and contributed mightily, I think, to film culture. I can't begin to tell you the number of film reviews of this movie or articles that people have written about this movie since it's come out, where the first paragraph is about how they grew up watching Siskel and Ebert and it made them want to be a movie critic or made them fall in love with movies. So that show played an enormous role in a very positive way. But I think you're right. It wasn't until he could no longer be on television that he kind of got back, at least in the public mind. He was writing all along.
Right. No, of course. Right.
In the public mind, a reconnection with him as a writer. And I think what made Roger such a great writer wasn't that he was the biggest stylist around. He's not. And it wasn't that he certainly didn't write in the most intellectual fashion. I think that was one of his virtues. He wrote in a very straightforward, elegant, simple, concise, and personal style. And I think those were the hallmarks of his writing that did set him apart from most, if not all, the contemporaries.
What's funny is I get the feeling that watching this, if Siskel had been more open about his battle when he was dying, that in a weird way, maybe this film never gets made. I feel that, maybe Ebert wanted to be more open about it because, I forget who said it in the movie. Maybe it was Chaz, that, he was so hurt and so upset by not knowing really during the process that he felt like he was never going to hide that about people he loved.
Well, I think you're right. It is Chaz that says that, and that's almost a direct quote. I think you're pretty good there for having seen the movie a week ago.
Not bad.
You saw it a week. I think you're right in that sense that was the connection that he made about thinking about his own illness should it come. But I also think that it's more in Roger's nature as and I think you hope you get this some from the film, is that Roger was just a more open, embracing kind of person and critic than Gene. I mean, I think part of what fueled their creative alchemy was the fact that Gene was a much more cool customer, a much more by nature analytical kind of reviewer looking at films. Not that Roger didn't have analytical powers. He had tremendous analytical powers, but he tended to write from his heart more than from his head. And So in that way, I think that Roger might have found himself in this place anyway, because I think that his sharing of all that he went through with the illness was always something that felt like it was for us who were reading it and following it, not for him to say, "Hey, look at me," you know. It never felt selfish to me. Now, maybe that's because I was a fan of it. Maybe some people look at that and think, "Oh, he's just, got to be in the limelight even with illness." But I never looked at it that way, and I know that a lot of people, probably most people who read him, didn't look at it that way. And so he was just a more open person. Gene was just always a very private person.
One quick non-life itself question is about three subjects. How are Gates, Agee, and Stevie doing today?
Well, that's a hard one to answer quickly.
Well, how is Stevie? Yeah.
Stevie is I've lost touch with him, and I don't think the situation is great for him. I stayed in touch with him for many, many years, but I've lost touch with him. But William Gates and Arthur Agee, things are going well for them.
All right, great, Steve. I appreciate your time. I really do. Great documentary.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. That's Life Itself, the director Steve James. It's available on demand now, The Life of Roger Ebert. Must watch. You should definitely watch that if you get a chance.